Hello, and welcome back to what was supposed to be a very festive episode of the Alexander Society.
I do apologize. Blame nothing but Vegeta. That damn proud Saiyan.
Yeah, this was supposed to be a Christmas episode. It can still technically be a holiday episode, but it's just going to be out.
I guess it's going to be our New Year's episode because that's probably when it's going to come out.
Yeah, so it the Christmas theme was tenuous to start off with, but and anyways, this is the Alexander Society. I'm your host, celebrating Christmas with a flagon full of homemade ale with all my brothers in the monastery, Derek. Joined by my friend, the one monk in the corner warning us we'll be damned to perdition for all of this sin, Tim. How's it going, Tim?
Well, aren't we all always damned to perdition? I'm doing pretty good. How about you?
I know I am. I'm damned to perdition, especially for all of the the war crimes. So yeah, Tim, how was your Christmas?
It went pretty good. First years with my niece home, so that was an experience. It felt like childhood again because we actually did presents like most of us, and like the tree actually looks like it does when you actually have money to be buying presents, even though we're all broke bitches. We just had such a big family that it was a lot.
Yeah, my Christmas was pretty good. I did a lot of running around because I had my family's Christmas and my wife's family's Christmas, so it was all pretty good. A lot of food. I also had to work Christmas Eve, so that kind of sucked. Um, I got off at 7. I still had time to spend the actual night with my family, so not a huge deal. I've found out that me being into Warhammer and just miniatures, my family really doesn't know what to get me anymore because that's my hobby, and they don't know anything about it. And so I just got a bunch of money, and they were like this, yeah, the money's.
Fair enough. Fair enough. They could have done what I did and just been like, okay, here's a fuckload of paint.
I did use a little bit of my Christmas money to get myself a few new models, but not too many. I've also got plenty saved up. But yeah, looky at what I got. So here's one. This is I got myself a squad of electro priests for my AdMech army, and then I've got.
Hell yeah.
Oh yeah, what are you drinking?
Okay. So tonight I am drinking 5 beers because, this is the third attempt at this recording, so we're just kind of wonky on our beers available, at least for me. The first one is St. Bernardus Christmas Ale from St. Bernard's, which we had on. It was the St. Nick episode. They had it. I didn't have this particular one, but I had from their brewery, and it was really, really good. Even though Derek doubted my Belgian's taste, it was really good. It's a bit darker than I normally prefer, but it's still really good. And then I've got from Prairie. They have a 8-pack sour out that's called Box of Treats. The first one is Peach Crumble Treat. The second one is Blue Buns Treat. Third one is Thai Delight Treat. And the fourth one is Caramel Apple Treat. I'm not going to read the descriptions for each one, but I'm going to read the alcohols. So Peach is 5.3. Blue Buns is 6.8. Thai is 5.1. And then Caramel Apple is 5.5. And Bernard's was 9.8.
That is a hefty beer.
It's delicious.
Yeah, it sounds really good. I think I still don't like Blue Moon. I will never like Blue Moon.
I think that's just Blue Moon being shit.
Yeah, but I think I've found a few Belgians that I'm kind of starting to change my mind on Belgians a little bit. I'm not drinking them tonight, but I just got some to drink on my nights off. It's a Belgian white with like tangerine and turmeric in it, and it is so good.
I'm not a big fan of turmeric. It kind of just tastes like you added like blandness to stuff.
Really, I get like I get like a little bit more of a sharpness. I can't actually like describe what turmeric tastes like off the top of my head, but
I can't describe what a lot of like seasonings taste like, other than like the ones right there in your face. But like turmeric is one of the ones that I just get like mute. It feels like it mutes it to me, any kind of flavor. And before I forget, for my liquor, I am having Baron Jaeger honey liqueur, which is a 35% alcohol, which is high for a liqueur, and it's a thick liqueur.
yeah, it's thick is an understatement. It's like
It's thick.
it's just a thin honey with alcohol. That's what it is.
I mean, this is what I wanted mead to be growing up.
I still haven't. Can you believe I still haven't tried mead?
I thought you had a mead on the podcast.
No, I haven't had mead before.
I don't recall if I have or not. I guess that needs to be like, we'll do some kind of Viking themed episode eventually. And
Oh, buddy, do I have some in the works for you? What I have to drink tonight is I'm finally trying that well, I already tried it, but I'm finally pulling out that peach cobbler sour ale that you got me from Anthem Brewing. So this is it's literally peach cobbler sour ale. It's a 5.1. It literally tastes like a sour ale, but also has like peach cobbler. Like you can taste the crust, you can taste the spices, you can taste it tastes like fresh peach that was baked into a cobbler. It's not artificial at all. It actually tastes like cobbler, and it's mind-blowing. It is crazy.
I was not lying when I told you. I was like, holy shit, this is the best thing I've had.
Yeah, Anthem is so good, man. They are so good at what they do. Holy shit.
Anthem knows they shit.
I've got that, and then for my shots, I'm pulling out. This is a drink that I got for my birthday from my aunt and my cousin. It is Mount Gay Barbados rum. This is their black barreled. It's so good.
You want to have a jolly gay time?
I do want to have a jolly. You know what? Fuck it. I'm gay for this rum. This rum made me gay. But yeah, this is a Mount Gay Barbados rum. This is the black barrel double cask blend. It's really dark. It's so the cask.
It's almost as dark as my soul.
I'd argue darker actually. It was aged in. It's really dark. It's really like well, you know what I say, like kick you in the teeth sort of flavor.
Mm-hmm.
And it was aged in whiskey and charred bourbon casks, so it has a lot of like a whiskey and bourbon flavor to it, and I really like it. It also has like a little bit of like it says notes of gingerbread, lychee, and toffee, and especially the toffee. The toffee actually comes out a lot. It adds like a... So yeah. So I'm going to be enjoying some Mount Gay tonight, and fuck all of you.
You're not my type, brother.
So here in our illustrious society, we abide by an ever-changing set of rules. Rule number 1. Every time someone is forced into a monastery, we're going to take a sip.
Every time the church is involved, we're going to take 3 sips.
And rule number 3, every time our main character is a ruthless bastard, what are we going to do?
We're going to take a damn right shot. Cheers.
Prost. All right, we settled in. You ready to go? As always, let's lay down some background. And we are, of course, going back to the area that I seem to spend the most time on, which is the fall of the Roman Empire.
Yay! The Romans are back!
So, after centuries of decline and collapse, the Western Roman Empire ceased to be during the 5th century. In its place was a collection of kingdoms that were ruled by Germanic peoples that were acting as it was like a military noble caste over Roman subjects. In Iberia, you had the Visigoths. In Italy, you had the Ostrogoths. North Africa, you had the Vandals. In Britain, you had the Angles and the Saxons. And importantly for our story, in Gaul, you had the Franks, which is where we get the name France.
Fuck the French.
Yeah, that's fair. I was thinking like, what if
It's like instinct by now, but
we'll get. It's complicated because our character today is kind of both like a precursor to France and Germany. So he's like he's French, but he's also German.
he's straddling the ethnic line.
Yeah, like. Or he existed before the ethnic line. The ethnic line becomes a thing because of what he does.
Oh, damn.
So, like, it's complicated. But...
As many things in history are.
Yeah. So, in Gaul specifically, the early Frankish rule was a bit divided and not really all that centralized. And they didn't have a king at first. It was just a collection of Frankish warlords who intermarried with the local Roman nobility, and they ruled over their own little regions. So you can see the base. This is kind of the base of the pyramid that would eventually become feudalism, but it's not really feudalism quite yet as we would recognize it. That would start to change when one particular guy managed to unite the Franks through diplomacy and conquest under his rule. This guy named Hlodwig, who's better known as Clovis I. Clovis would become known as the first king of France, though France didn't really exist at this point. It was called Francia. And Francia would go through a couple evolutions before it would become the France that we know and hate today. And also, Francia wasn't all of modern-day France. It was just the northern bit, with Paris smack in the middle. You still had, in southern France, you still had in the southwest the Duchy of Aquitaine, and then in the southeast you had the Burgundians, the Burgundy. So, anyways, Clovis's family, they were called the Merovingian Dynasty, and they would rule France for a couple hundred years. Under the Merovingian rule, Francia would come to control the Kingdom of Burgundy, which is roughly like southeastern France and Switzerland, as well as the Low Countries up north, which are now Belgium and the Netherlands. The problem was the Franks practiced this dumb form of inheritance called partible inheritance, where every time the king died, the kingdom would be split up evenly between all the king's sons.
Which is dumb as fuck.
And it would kind of just be, which is dumb as fuck, because it would be kind of expected that the sons would kind of co-rule as kings. Sometimes like the oldest son would be considered like the senior king, and have like seniority, but usually what ended up happening is one of the brothers would just kill the other brothers and take all of their land. And so that's how it kind of worked for a couple hundred years, as Francia managed to kind of stay whole and continue its like expansion, because every time that you had multiple kings, one of them would just kill the others and kind of keep control for himself.
I mean, it sounds like the shit that happens with rulers and such. It's dumb as fuck, but it happens.
Yeah. So this system started to really become a problem in the late 600s when one Frankish king, King Childeric II, was assassinated. And once he died, every nobleman in the kingdom started to invade one another.
Of course they did.
This civil war finally came to an end when Childeric's basically it kind of sort of like a prime minister. It was a title called the Mayor of the Palaces, or also called a Majordomo. Technically, this was only supposed to be like an administrative position. It was supposed to be the guy that was in charge of managing all of the royal house's finances and all of their different palaces, and basically like the economics of the house. But Childeric's Majordomo, his Mayor of the Palaces, was this guy named Pippin of Herstal. Yeah, after Childeric died, Pippin managed to use his power over the royal finances to centralize all of the power of the dynasty into his own office, and using that authority, he managed to reconquer all of the rebel nobles within the kingdom, and basically reunited all of the Frankish lands. And so he became the undisputed most powerful person in the kingdom, even though there was still technically a Merovingian king on the throne. But that king basically just became a puppet. So when Pippin of Herstal died, his son Charles took his position as ruler of Francia. Charles is one of those guys who's just lives basically like a real-life superhero. Like, he is the guy that like the heroes of like fantasy settings are based off of. Like, I'm fairly sure there are at least a couple characters in Lord of the Rings that are based off of this guy.
Does that surprise me in the least bit? Not really. Like, there's a lot of characters that are based off of historical figures in all kinds of media.
Yeah, and Tolkien specifically was a huge history nerd, and he based a lot of his characters and a lot of his setting off of like real world examples from this era of history. This part of the Middle Ages was very influential on the development of the fantasy genre. A lot of people kind of associate the fantasy genre with like the late Middle Ages of like knights, because there's like knights and castles and stuff. But a lot of the characters and a lot of the themes have a lot to do with more like the era that's sort of closer, like the early Middle Ages, like closer to like shortly after the fall of the Roman Empire, which is where we're kind of looking.
Gotcha.
So this guy, Charles, is better known today as Charles Martel. Martel being a medieval French term that translates as the hammer. His name was Charles the Hammer, which goes so fucking hard.
It's the hammer!
Can you imagine getting onto a battlefield and you find out that the army across from you is led by a guy who has the nickname the Hammer? Like, you just give up. You just give up. Like, you don't, you know, maybe it's just a nickname and there's nothing behind it, but I'm not going to take that chance.
No, we throw our lives away like real men.
Oh, yeah, of course, absolutely. So while Charles was ruling over the kingdom of Francia in the early 700s, the Arab conquests had kind of firmly established Muslim rule in the Middle East and in North Africa, and just recently, an army of Muslim invaders had conquered the Iberian Peninsula, which meant that there was now an expansionist Muslim kingdom on the southern border of Francia called the Emirate of Al-Andalus. Later on, the Al-Andalus would be replaced by the Emirate of Cordoba, but at this time it was Al-Andalus. So Charles was leading Frankish forces against the Duchy of Aquitaine, which is kind of in southwestern France. Technically, Aquitaine was supposed to be a vassal of the Franks, but at this point, they were in revolt. And so the Duchy of Aquitaine, in order to try and gain their independence, asked for help from the Emirate of Al-Andalus. And so the Andalusians ended up invading, and they marched their armies through Aquitaine into northern France, where the Franks ruled. And they tried to march on the Frankish city of Tours. Charles Martel managed to catch the Andalusians there and obliterated their army, which forced them to withdraw back to Iberia. And this is the battle that Charles Martel is famous for. This is because this was the last major incursion of Muslim forces into Western Europe. After this, there wouldn't be any more invasions of Western Europe by Muslim forces.
Damn.
Which is a really big deal. But more important to our story, Charles Martel was just generally a conqueror. He conquered a lot of land using the armies of Francia, and he expanded both the physical borders of the Frankish kingdom and also gained the vassalage of several kind of local kingdoms as well. So in 737, the puppet king that was ruling under the actual rulership of Charles Martel, this guy named Theodoric IV, ended up dying without an heir. And so Charles just decided that he wouldn't support another Merovingian, and so the throne became vacant. And he decided that when he died, the kingdom would be split up between his two sons, Charlemagne and Pepin. And Pepin would later be known as Pepin the Short.
Hey, this fucker's short.
Yeah, this motherfucker. They would rule technically under the title of dukes, but they would effectively be in control of the kingdom. Pepin would get the west, and Charlemagne would get the east. So Charles Martel died, and this split went into effect, and for a little while it seemed like they were getting along fine, and they ruled together and amicably for a while. Then in 747, Charlemagne had a mysterious call to faith, and he decided to abdicate his title, and he traveled to Rome, where he became a monk.
Sip, because I feel like that's forced into a monastery.
Yeah, no, there's no fucking way he wasn't forced.
Yeah, there's no way he just does that. He gives up his rulership and all that. No.
Nobody gives up power like that. That just doesn't happen. So it isn't entirely clear why he did this. All the sources from the time say that he genuinely felt called by God to take up the cloth, but a lot of historians think that he was probably politically outmaneuvered by Pepin and forced to abdicate.
Which sounds way more reasonable than, hey, I found God, I'm going to throw away my title.
Right. So Pepin abdicated, and his lands were taken over by his son Drogo. But later on in the year 753, Pepin managed to convince the Pope to support a takeover, and so Drogo was captured and forced to become a monk, and Francia was completely united under Pepin's rule.
Another sip.
That's another sip. This happens so often because back in the Middle Ages, it was considered very controversial to murder another Christian. And so whenever you'd have one of these political things, instead of murdering your political rival when you beat them, you would force them into a monastery, and it was effectively as good as killing them because once they become a monk, they can never be involved in politics again.
What? Why?
Because monks are supposed to live. Once you take the vows of like monastic vows, you're expected to live the rest of your life in abstinence, completely separate from the outside world. And to give up those vows was considered to be extremely shameful. So shameful that the brand of the shame of renouncing those vows to get back into politics would hinder their political career. They wouldn't be able to effectively rule because nobody would respect them.
Damn.
So they would have, especially in regards to like the Pope. The Pope was extremely politically influential, and to do a lot of stuff, you needed the Pope's support. And if you gave up your monastic vows to go and become a king again, the Pope would basically be like, "Nope, that's not how it works. You're not going to do that."
No. That's what the Pope did.
And so it was considered. Yeah, and so it was considered like a very politically expedient way to get somebody out of the way without actually having to kill them, because killing them would cause more problems.
But of course.
So that happened in 753. Let's back up a little bit to 744. Pepin had married a noblewoman by the name of Bertrada. Bertrada had a son. We don't know the exact year they had a son. Best bet is probably 748. We know the day, though. It's April 2nd. So probably April 2nd, 748. We also don't know where it was that this son was born. It was probably at one of Pepin's palaces somewhere in northern France, but we really just do not know.
Gotcha.
Whatever the case, Bertrada gave birth to a baby boy, and Pepin named this son after the boy's grandfather, Charles Martel. This Charles would eventually be known as Charles the Great, or in French, Charlemagne.
Here's another great.
Yeah, we haven't done too many greats, even though it was like we don't know a lot about Charlemagne's childhood. We don't know much about his personality as a kid or his family life. We do know he grew up speaking both Frankish and Latin as first languages, and he possibly picked up some Greek during his studies as well, but he did not learn how to read or write as a child. And that was pretty common at the time. Nobility didn't really have a need to be literate because priests were literate, and
that sounds so backwards to me, though.
Yeah, it sounds weird to us now, but back then that was just how it worked. Like, nobility didn't really have a need to, because all of the paperwork was done by priests, and they always had plenty of priests that were able to do all of that stuff, so they never really had a need for it.
I mean, you're the history major, so you would know better than I would. But yeah, because of the way we think of things today, it does feel bad.
Yeah, because learning how to read and write took a lot of time and effort and resources, and during the Middle Ages, you didn't have as much bureaucracy, and you didn't have as much to teach your kids, to be completely honest, because a lot of like classical literature that was kind of used for that, and that stuff was lost when the structure of the Roman state kind of fell apart. And so they didn't really have as much to teach their kids beyond just like statecraft and basic language, and if they did learn any literature, it was usually just scripture.
Gotcha.
So all of like the nitty gritty of like balancing checkbooks and stuff like that was kind of just left to priests, because priests were always literate. That was a part of their education to become priests. So later on in his life, he would actually get a bit self-conscious about his illiteracy, because he believed like he ruled over so many people. It seemed like a good skill to have. And so he would eventually learn how to read and write like as an adult.
Okay, good for you, learning things later on in life.
Yeah. And as part of that process, because whenever he did something, once he becomes ruler, whenever he does something for himself, it's not just him that does it. He does it for his whole kingdom.
Oh, damn.
And so when he decided that he wanted to learn how to read and write, he decided, I'm not just going to be the one reading and writing. This is going to be something that all of my subjects are going to be able to do. And so he started like the first known like mass literacy campaign in human history.
I mean, hell yes.
Yeah, and it's kind of speculated how much of this was deliberate and how much of it was incidental, because he did have like this conscious, well, later on when he would kind of start to consciously model his lands after like the Roman Empire. He would have this idea of kind of trying to centralize authority into his throne, which required a lot more bureaucracy than the sort of traditional feudal setup that the Franks had kind of used. And to kind of form that bureaucratic setup, he needed a lot more literate people. And so he would start pumping a whole shit ton of money into churches and into where do they train priests? He'd pump a shit ton of money into training priests so that he could have a lot more priests to be able to do this stuff. And he also encouraged these priests to, when they got out to their parishes and like just these far-flung parts of his kingdom, to teach their congregations how to read and write as well. Teach them how to read the Bible and how to write out like scripture and stuff like that. And so under his rule, his kingdom had one of the highest literacy, I think the highest literacy rate of any nation on the planet at the time.
Damn.
And that would later on result, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but that also resulted in this mass flourishing of arts and literature, because so many people had access to classical forms, like classical literature and classical art forms that they wouldn't have had before. Without the ability to read. And so that resulted in this sort of like early Renaissance. A Renaissance like 800 years before the actual Renaissance. It was called the Carolingian Renaissance.
It makes total sense that there were other Renaissances. I had no idea there were, though.
Yeah. It's the Renaissance kind of just generally refers to a rebirth of like classical concepts into the arts and philosophy of Western society. And the big main one was in like the 1500s, but you'd have like smaller sort of isolated versions of this, the most prominent one being the Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne. So sources at the reason we don't know much about Charlemagne's early life is because the sources at the time were preoccupied recording his dad's going on. So they didn't spend much time recording what he was up to. And that would eventually change. Yeah, that would eventually change when Charlemagne's father died.
That would be suck being upstaged by your dad, like when you're younger in life, only to find out you're going to be the more well remembered in history.
Yeah. Everybody knows the name Charlemagne. Nobody knows Pepin the Short. Yeah, just like everybody knows Alexander. Nobody knows his dad. I can't even remember his dad's name off the top of my head. But everybody knows Alexander. Nobody knows his dad.
I remember you covered his name and like how important he was at the time, but like,
oh yeah, he was wildly important. He just happened to give birth to one of the greatest men who ever lived. So like,
well, we remember Zeus.
Yeah, we remember Zeus. So by 752, Pepin had overthrown the last. So the Merovingian throne, the throne of Francia, was vacant at this point. Nobody had actually filled the throne, and it had just been ruled by Charles Martel and Pepin. So in 752, Pepin managed to basically get rid of the last Merovingian claimant to the throne, and he had himself crowned as King of Francia with the sanction of Pope Stephen II. And so he became King Pepin III, and he founded a new dynasty called the Carolingian Dynasty, which interestingly, it's called the Carolingian Dynasty today because Carolus is the Latin form of the name Charles. Even though he founded it, it was named after his son.
So basically it's the Charles dynasty?
Yeah, but even though Pepin founded it, it was named after his son.
Hey, revenge.
So Charlemagne got his first taste of war in the year 760 when he accompanied his father on campaign to suppress Aquitaine, who were kind of like I said, kind of supposed to be under Francia's rule, but had repeatedly rebelled over the centuries. Unfortunately, while on campaign and eight years into this campaign, Pepin got sick and died in 768, leaving the kingdom to be split up between Charlemagne and his younger brother Carloman. Charlemagne was probably about 20 years old.
I couldn't imagine trying to lead an entire country at 20.
If it makes you feel any better, it's really hard to just completely ruin a country, because countries have a lot of you can have like a long line of real fucking idiots in power in a country, and it'll be bad for the people involved, but the country will still limp on. So like, you have to be a special breed of stupid in very specific circumstances to actually like destroy a country, like the last Roman emperors.
Yeah.
So Charlemagne took over, and he picked up the campaign where his father left off, and he would eventually capture the Duke of Aquitaine a year later, or later that year.
Damn.
But his brother Carloman, refused to help finish the war. We're not really sure why, but they had some sort of falling out and started disagreeing about stuff immediately upon taking the throne. And that, like we've established, it's bad when brothers disagree with each other and they're ruling a kingdom together. That results in deaths.
Obviously.
And so immediately upon taking the throne, both of them started maneuvering behind each other's backs in order to gain allies amongst the nobility and amongst the church. Things started to get really ugly when the Pope started sending out calls for help. Rome's territories in Italy were bordered to their north by the Germanic kingdom of Lombardy. So it was a kingdom in North Italy that was ruled by Germans called the Lombards.
Interesting.
And the Lombards had started messing with some of the political... Basically, there were a bunch of political divisions that were happening in Rome at this time over who should actually be the Pope. And the Lombards were kind of capitalizing on this and asserting their claims over lands that were supposed to be ruled by the Vatican. Carloman started putting armies near the border with Lombardy in order to keep pressure off of the Pope. Basically, like, if you mess with the Pope, you'll have our armies to deal with too, which made him kind of an ally of the Pope. Charlemagne decided to undercut his brother by forming an alliance with the Lombards. And to solidify this alliance, he married a Lombard princess named Desiderata. If the Lombards continued to press their influence in Rome, and it eventually became war between Rome and the Lombards, then that would also mean it would become war between Charlemagne and Carloman.
Fun.
Yeah. Luckily for everyone, it didn't come to that, because Carloman mysteriously died in 771 on a hunting trip.
Just fucking, like, obvious assassination in history.
Obvious assassination, but that's where the sort of fantasy and medieval stereotype of like, oh yeah, he died on a hunting trip. Yeah, real tragic.
I didn't really even realize that was that old. I just thought that was, hey, they went out in the woods and this guy tried to say it was a hunting accident and it didn't, and then it just became a meme.
Yeah, it's a real life. Who was George W. Bush's vice president again? What was his name?
I don't remember.
There's this real... Oh, fuck. Dick Cheney.
I thought maybe it was Dick Cheney, but I didn't know if he was for both terms or not.
Yeah, so there's this really, really like classic story where Dick Cheney, while he was vice president, he was out hunting with a friend of his, and he mistook his friend for a deer and shot him.
Do you think he actually did, or do you think that was the cover story? Because Dick Cheney's pretty fucking stupid.
I think he was just fucking stupid. I don't think he didn't have any reason to actually try to kill the guy. It kind of shows Dick Cheney's ruthlessness too, because he strong-armed his friend that he shot into publicly coming out and apologizing to Dick Cheney.
What?
The guy that Dick Cheney shot was forced to come out and apologize to the guy that shot him.
The actual fuck?
Dick Cheney's a fucking monster. So, Carloman mysteriously died in 771 on a hunting trip. So now that he was dead, Charlemagne became the sole king of Francia. After that, Carloman's widow fled from Francia and was taken in, interestingly, by the king of the Lombards, this guy named King Desiderius. And this was weird because the Carloman had a confrontational relationship with the Lombards. He was taking the side of the Pope. But after Carloman died, his widow and his son, who was his heir, went and they came under the protection of the Lombards. That didn't go over well with Charlemagne. He got really pissed off at that.
Well, of course not.
Having a living heir to the Frankish throne was a threat to his political power.
Hold on, was that one hunting accident? Would you say that's main character being ruthless, or was he directly involved?
It's not known. It's not known if he was directly involved, but if he was, that would be like the ruthless rule.
Definitely ruthless. But I guess since he can't stand there being a successor, it's going to be ruthless. So finish up what you were saying, and then we'll take the shot.
So Charlemagne was pissed off. So he broke his alliance with the Lombards by divorcing his Lombard wife, which realigned him politically with the Pope against the Lombards.
I don't care what he does after that. That's ruthless as fuck. You divorce your wife? What the what?
Because women are political tokens, Tim. What's not to understand about that?
I guess I'm a hopeless and romantic and really want to believe in the cherishedness nature of a fucking relationship. But I guess I'm the fucking fool.
You gotta grow up. The only use for women is to secure political alliances. There's no other reason.
And an heir.
And to produce babies. Those are the two uses for women. Other than that, they're not important. God, I feel so fucking dirty right now. Oh, God. Ugh.
I am glad you immediately were like, I don't feel comfortable saying this.
Yeah, I actually feel really bad saying that. Oh, my skin is crawling right now. Fuck. And this is...
I'm surprised you were able to hold the joke, the bit that long.
Yeah, and what makes it worse is that this is just how women were treated for most of human history. Like, for the bulk of the time that people have been writing down stuff that humans have done, this is just how women were treated. It just makes my skin crawl. So yeah. That was ruthless, right? You want to go ahead and shoot for that?
Cheers.
Prost. After Carloman's widow and son are forced to go and take refuge with the Lombards, let's just take stock real quick. Thanks to the military conquests of Charles Martel and the political maneuvering of Pippin, and then the timely death of Carloman, Francia now encompasses a landmass that makes up all of modern-day France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. And now all of that power and wealth is in the hands of one single man.
Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yes, but this guy would turn out to be one of the most brilliant political and military minds of the Middle Ages. He is Alexander the Great levels of brilliant.
For real?
He had different tools, and he had different political machines to work with. But as far as a political thinker and as far as a military thinker, it's very easy to compare him to Alexander. And I'm not going to go into nobody ever goes into details about medieval battles. So I'm not going to go into details about any of his battles, specific battles, but even just the broad strokes, the broad overview of what we're going to talk about with this guy in just broad terms is going to shake the foundations of the continent and build the bedrock of what would eventually become modern Europe. And it would all be built off of the machinations of this one guy's mind, which is why Charlemagne now holds the title, the nickname of the grandfather of Europe.
Wow. I didn't know that was a title.
Yeah, he is. No single individual was as influential in the creation of what is now Europe and all of the consequences that went with that than this one guy.
Christ almighty.
Once Charlemagne gets complete power over the kingdom of Francia, the first thing he does is he goes to war, naturally, because it's a king in the Middle Ages. He goes to war. At this point, there are two divergent groups of a tribe of Germans called the Saxons. One of those groups migrated and settled in Britain, intermixed with both the local Roman population and also with another tribe called the Angles, and eventually became what would eventually become English people.
Okay.
The other one stayed behind in northern Germany and eventually became me and my family.
Damn.
At this time, the German Saxons were still pagans. And they had been, during this time, they had been crossing over the Rhine River in order to raid Frankish towns and generally just do some pillaging. They love to do them. This is the age of Viking, or we're about to get into the age of Vikings at this point. And these are kind of in that same mold. They weren't Scandinavians, but they were still like Germanic pagans. They had a culture of raiding and pillaging in order to collect wealth, and then that wealth would be used for political clout once they got home. And that's kind of the basis for what Vikings were. They just, this particular group of, I guess technically you could call them Vikings, but they weren't technically Vikings because Vikings were sailors.
Gotcha.
They were pirates. So they were raiders, but they weren't quite Vikings. There's a little distinction. They were raiding Frankish towns and generally doing some pillaging. They particularly liked attacking churches because the same reason that Vikings attacked churches. They always had a lot of gold and silver in them, and they were only ever defended by unarmed priests. And so they were really rich and really easy targets.
Sounds about right.
Charlemagne wanted to put a stop to all of this because if nothing else, Charlemagne was like a genuinely he had genuine religious convictions. And that would be a problem later on.
Well, of course.
So the first thing that he does is he invades the Saxon territory in northern Germany in 772, and he subjugates a tribe called the Angrians. As repayment...
Are they angry?
They are angry, yes. They end up becoming very angry at this whole situation.
She's angry!
It's Angrian. The first letter is an E. Angrian. As repayment for sacking their churches, Charlemagne wanted to repay them in kind, and so once he took over the Angrians, he went to their central settlement and he cut down their sacred tree, the Irminsul. The Irminsul is a deeply important symbol in Germanic pagan religion. It's not really clear whether it was like an actual living tree or if it was just like a decorated tree trunk. But it was basically it represented like in Norse mythology, you have like the Yggdrasil, which like the life tree, the universe tree that connected all of the realms. This southern Germanic paganism kind of had a similar theology, and the Irminsul represented that sort of like universal tree, the connection of all of the 9 realms. It represented like death and rebirth, and it was the central most important like religious artifact in their faith.
Gotcha.
And Charlemagne sent his soldiers in and cut it down.
Ooh, that fucker.
That fucker. After that, he marched his armies further east and nearly conquered basically just swept in and conquered all of Saxony. So he started with the Angrians and cut down their tree to send a message, and then he went and conquered the rest of Saxony. After doing this, with very little effort on his part, actually, he set up some fortresses in order to police his new lands, and then he went away. Shortly after he left, the Saxons started revolting, and once again they started pillaging churches. So Charlemagne came back. He put the beat down on the Saxons. Shortly after Charlemagne left, the Saxons started revolting, and once again they began pillaging. So Charlemagne came back. He put the beat down on the Saxons again, and then he captured the rebel leader, a guy named Hesse, and forced Hesse to convert to Christianity. After that, he rebuilt his fortresses, and then he left. Then, once again, the Saxons started revolting, destroyed his fortresses, and started pillaging. So Charlemagne said, and I quote, "I'm not going to sugarcoat it. He recruited a bunch of Anglo-Saxon priests from England, and he used them to start spreading the word of God." Once again, the Saxons revolted, destroyed his fortresses, and started pillaging. So Charlemagne said, and I quote, "I'm not going to sugarcoat it." So he recruited a bunch of Anglo-Saxon priests from England, and he used them to start spreading the word of God. And any Saxons who refused to convert were subject to public torture and execution.
As is typical.
Yeah, these forced conversions were so brutal and violent that even some of Charlemagne's most religious and devout advisors were like, "Hey, whoa, holy shit, Charlie, let's take it down a couple notches."
This is the church. 3 sips.
3 sips. If there's one thing that Charlemagne was bad at, it was taking it down a couple notches.
So he didn't know how to de-escalate?
No, de-escalate was not in his vocabulary. He was escalate. Okay, that's not true. Later in his life, when he was a mild old man, he would learn how de-escalation works. And he would actually be pretty good at it. At this point, he has one setting, and that setting is 11.
He knows one word, and that is kill.
Yeah, during this period, he starts getting referred to by one of his most famous monikers, one of his most famous nicknames, the Butcher of Saxons.
Oh, goddamn.
Yeah, thousands of people. So along with all this, he also divided up Saxon land into plots, and he started handing out those plots to people who were loyal to them. And he ended up making them dukes. And so effectively what this was the first introduction of the system of feudalism into Germany. This is how feudalism made it east. Feudalism was invented by the Franks, or kind of not really consciously invented, just kind of developed by the Franks. And Charlemagne's rule is how feudalism spread throughout Europe. It's how basically the end of like the tribal system of Europe, like the old European, like Germanic tribes, and the introduction of feudalism. That's how it became entrenched as the dominant economic and political system of Europe during the Middle Ages.
Damn.
So for a little while, this put a stop to the revolts in Saxony. We're not going to talk about it. We're going to move away from it for a minute. But as a spoiler alert, this is not going to last.
No shit. Nothing lasts in history.
So in 772, Pope Stephen II died, and Pope Adrian I succeeded him. Adrian was sick of all of this Lombard business in North Italy and wanted to try and get back papal land from the Lombard king. First, he tried diplomacy, but that didn't work, so then he approached Charlemagne for help. Charlemagne was still mad about the Lombards taking his former sister-in-law and her kids, because as long as they were in the picture, they could make a claim for his throne. Also, if he helped the Pope out, that would give him a lot more political power throughout the Christian world. That'd give him a lot of legitimacy in like through like a spiritual lens. So first, Charlemagne offered to buy both the church land and his nephews from the Lombard king Desiderius, but Desiderius didn't bite. He couldn't be bought like that. So Charlemagne marched his armies out and invaded Lombardy. Also, when he set out on this campaign, his wife would come along with him.
Okay, that's an interesting twist I haven't heard in the show so far.
Yeah, sometimes families would accompany. If it was expected to be kind of a short campaign, they just kind of bring their families along. Sometimes it happened. In this particular instance, she would end up having 2 kids, a son named Charles and a daughter named Adelaide. Unfortunately, when Adelaide was born, Charlemagne sent his family back home because a military camp is really no place for 2 babies. But on the way, his Adelaide died.
Ooh, that sucks.
What's weird is this was actually his second and third children. Before he married his first wife, the Lombard wife, he actually had an affair, and they had a kid together. But I'm going to talk about that kid later, but he's not going to be super important to the story. I'll tell you more about him later, but what you need to know is that he is in the picture. Charlemagne fucking hates him. Also, this kid has a deformation. He has a really bad hunchback. And so because he is both a bastard and also a hunchback, he is effectively just disqualified from inheriting any titles.
Does that surprise me in the least with how ableist history has been? Nope.
Yeah, he's not going to be happy about that when he gets older.
Well, of course not.
So eventually, Charlemagne's armies captured the Lombard city of Verona, where his sister-in-law and his nephews were hiding. And then so he captures Verona, and he captures his sister-in-law and his nephews, and we don't know what happened to them.
What?
Yeah, they just disappear. They're never heard from again.
That sounds like he fucking killed them.
It sure sounds like that, but we don't know for sure. They didn't record what happened, what Charlemagne did with them.
If they didn't show up in history in anything, and there's no recorded, trying to think of the word, heirs from them, I'm counting them as dead, and I'm counting them as a ruthlessness shot.
Oh, sure. Why not? Prost.
Cheers.
Yeah. Also, I thought it was interesting. The Verona was the second largest city in the Kingdom of Lombardy. Verona is the city where the Shakespeare play of Romeo and Juliet takes place.
I did not know that they set Romeo and Juliet in like a real life city.
Yeah, fair Verona. After capturing Verona, he turned his armies to the Lombard capital of Pavia, and he besieged it. And after I think something like 11 months or something like that of siege, he finally captures it. So with the capture of Pavia, he overthrows the Lombard king Desiderius, and for his help, the Pope made an alliance with Charlemagne, where Charlemagne would protect papal lands in Italy, and in exchange, the Pope would basically just rubber stamp any political or military action that Charlemagne wanted to take, so that politically people might have some arguments against like what Charlemagne does, but spiritually he was completely in the clear from this point forward.
Spiritually in the clear.
Yeah, so and in the Middle Ages, that's important. Like that is political. Here's something weird that happened with that though. The primary copy of the treaty that was signed between Charlemagne and the Pope was symbolically left on the tomb of Saint Peter in Rome. And okay, so the Pope and Charlemagne, they make this treaty. The primary copy of the treaty was left on the tomb of Saint Peter in Rome, and then it disappeared. And there were other copies of it, but those other copies were also eventually lost to history. And so we don't have exact information on we don't have exact information on what lands were Charlemagne agreed to protect, the lands that were under the control of the Vatican.
So they can't find the papers, so they can argue back and forth what was protected, what wasn't?
Yeah, so after Charlemagne's death, this would cause a whole bunch of problems because Charlemagne's heirs would have issues with coming to the Pope's aid in certain situations. So the Pope would say, hey, you are bound by treaty signed with Charlemagne, Charles the Great, to help us when these lands are being disputed, but they don't have copies. So the heirs to Charlemagne would just be like, no, we don't. It wasn't in the treaty. And there's no way to dispute that because they don't have original copies. And so one thing would lead to another. Eventually the Pope would be like, okay, I'm going to excommunicate you. And that would cause a whole bunch of political problems. And it just caused a whole bunch of problems between Charlemagne's heirs and the Vatican and the church later on.
Does that surprise me in the least? No. Sounds like the church and everything else. Do you think it was this Pope overstepping or his heirs overstepping?
Both.
That's kind of what I was guessing.
Yeah, the actual from their perspectives, in the very nitty-gritty of it, the actual contents of the treaty, they didn't really matter. It was what they argued and what they could successfully claim that it said.
Oh, obviously.
Without the actual document, it didn't matter like what they believed in their hearts. It was all just like political maneuvering, what they could get out of the other.
That sounds about right.
Something that I think about a lot. Something that is trying to something that I think about a lot, especially with this era of history, is trying to reconcile the role of religion in a lot of the politics of what was going on, because politics at its core is a very cynical way of viewing the world. It's not ideological, it's not spiritual, it's very, very cynical. People do things in politics because it benefits them personally, and whatever ideology or spirituality they come up with to justify that.
This is why I say religion is not exclusive from politics as much as people want it to be, and like it can be, but your personal politics shapes your religion, even if you're not consciously shaping it.
Yeah, but another thing that's kind of shaped my opinion on religion as a concept is over the last 300 years, we've pretty firmly established that we don't need religion to do all of the things that religion has done, all of the bad things that religion has done in history. During this time, especially the Middle Ages, religion was not just an act of spirituality. It was the ideology. It was the dominant ideology of politics at the time. It was like you can think of the church during this time the same way you kind of think of like ideological thinkers. Like a theologian was as much a political thinker as they were a theological thinker, because their theology informed politics. Their political concepts were viewed through the lens of religion, of what, like, how does this fit into the concept of the world that we believe that God was kind of trying to make. And that's something to keep in mind, because like it can genuinely inform how people act and behave in political situations, but at the same time it can also just be cynically used as a political tool. Like my favorite example is like of kind of ideology in that sort of sense is Joseph Stalin. Like Joseph Stalin at his core very much was a communist. He believed in the writings of Marx and Lenin. He believed in the ideology of the Bolsheviks and of the International Workers' Revolution. Like those were things he genuinely heartfelt believed. But at some level, he was also just using those concepts as like political tools. And that's how politics worked with in the Middle Ages as well. People used the ideology of Christian religion to justify things that would benefit them politically. And so something that I struggle with a lot, kind of trying to wrap my head around, is just how does that work? How does that fit together? How do you square that circle of how much of religion is genuine, heartfelt spirituality and how much of it is just cynical self-serving? And you can't know. You just can't know. Today you can't know how much, like those televangelists, how much of that is genuine faith and how much of it is cynical. Back then, and that's with people that we would be able to like physically talk to today. We can't talk to Charlemagne. We don't know how much of what he believed was genuine. We don't know if it was all just cynical. Because to him, religion and politics were the same thing.
I'd argue, even people who are alive right now, like, I'd argue you can't ask Trump. I don't know how much Trump actually believes a lot of the religious leaning things he spews and not. I don't think he does. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't think he understands how much he's just like spewing bullshit and how much like he genuinely believes. I don't think he understands it either.
Yeah, that's another thing. Like with Trump, we could say obviously he doesn't know much about Christianity. Obviously he doesn't. Like the few Bible verses he's used in like interviews where like most of the time he gets wrong, and when he uses them they're very obviously like rehearsed. But at the same time, like there are a lot of Christians that like hold very genuine beliefs in God and Christianity that don't know a lot about Scripture. So like, how can we know how much he believes and how much is just cynical?
Really know how much each individual quote unquote Christian believes in the doctrine, because they don't know how much they actually believe, because like it's the concept of false flags and how much do you believe truly like within your soul when it comes down when you're tested in the moment in something versus what you believe and spout day to day when you're not tested.
Yeah, and then on the flip side of that coin, like I'm forced to kind of confront like how much of my beliefs are genuine. Like I kind of start to question myself, like how much of it is I genuinely have, like I have my beliefs and I genuinely believe them. I'm very passionate about them, and I think to some extent I squared the circle. Like, yeah, I believe them because they benefit me, but in a broader sense, I kind of believe that they benefit me because they benefit everybody. Like the world that I want to see created, I believe is good because it doesn't just benefit me, but benefits all people. How much of that is because it benefits all people and how much of that is because it benefits me? And I kind of have to confront that when I think about this stuff, is like, how much of my ideology, how much of my beliefs is self-serving and how much...
Because it's convenient to believe in your own mindset versus what you genuinely have as core pillars of your personality.
So the siege of Pavia finally ends in June of 774. The Lombards finally surrender, and King Desiderius surrenders, and Charlemagne did something that nobody had expected.
What did Charlemagne do?
He forcibly deposed Desiderius, and he crowned himself king of the Lombards. And that seems...
Is that just something you would expect from a ruler, or is that some malicious shit?
So I don't know about malicious, but that it was unique. It hadn't happened. So the reason that was a big deal was because up to this point, since the fall of the Roman Empire, no Christian king had ever usurped another Christian king's title. Like a Christian king could go and conquer like a pagan kingdom, and when he took over that kingdom, he would take that title. This had never been done with another Christian king. So this was a really fucking big deal, and a lot of people were outraged at this. Like, this was a huge fucking deal. Like, this was a complete violation of all of their, like, deeply held, like, religious values.
I can imagine it. It sounds like a really, like, honestly, I don't know how he had the cojones to, like, pull that off, because it sounds like it would put a lot of people in a very religious panic that could have very, very easily led to an uprising.
Yeah. But the reason that he was able to get away with it was because by this point he had made that alliance with the Pope, and the Pope rubber stamped it.
Damn! He had the Pope on his side.
Yeah, the Pope came out and was like, yeah, Charlemagne is king of the Lombards now. That's a perfectly okay thing to do. So people were like, well, this hurts my sensibilities, but if the Pope is okay with it, the Pope is the authority of God on earth. So if he says it's okay, then God is okay with it. So it must be fine. So this was also a big deal for another reason. Traditionally, by this point, if a king beat another king in battle, traditionally he would force concessions from the other king in the form of land or money. The only reason to take his kingdom outright is if you're trying to build an empire.
What he ends up trying to do, but he doesn't say outright.
Yeah, he hasn't said it explicitly, but the only reason that you take another king's crown is to become a king of kings, which is like the concept of the king of kings, like that dates back to like ancient, like basically the ancient concept of an empire was an emperor was a king who owned many kingdoms, who was the king over several different kingdoms. And so if he was trying to become the king not just of Francia, but of the Lombards as well, he was trying to become an emperor.
Yeah, sounds like it.
And this is the time when people realized that Charlemagne wanted to build an empire, which was fucking crazy because nobody had tried to do that since Rome fell 300 years before. At this time, empires were a dead concept. The concept of an empire existing was a complete non sequitur. It was something that didn't exist in politics at this time.
It's something you didn't try because it proved to not be successful long term.
Not necessarily that, because everybody at this time revered the Roman Empire as like the height of civilization. And so the idea of copying it was kind of futile. It was like trying to be a god.
Okay, it's like heresy.
It wasn't necessarily heretical. It was more like...
No. I don't mean that it is heresy. It's like doing something that is heretical. It's like it's kind of futile, pointless, and it's not really going to help you.
Yeah, exactly. It was kind of that idea. It's like, what the fuck is he trying to do here? Like, the Roman Empire was a singular, unique thing that can't exist anymore. But here he was trying to do it again. Which is also funny for a different reason, because technically the Roman Empire still existed at this point in the form of the Byzantine Empire. Like, Constantinople was still ruled by Romans at this point. So like it was really funny that people thought this way, but it's the Middle Ages. Communication wasn't really. eh, as a sort of side note to kind of give context to what we're going to talk about later. At this point, Western Europeans, their only concept for like what the Roman Empire was the Western Roman Empire, which in their memory, in their cultural memory, had already fallen. It had collapsed and it was gone. It didn't exist anymore. They didn't really quite comprehend the idea that because when the Western Roman Empire fell, the Eastern Roman Empire kept going. And that's what the Byzantine Empire was. And so there were still Roman emperors, but in the West, they didn't really like see it like that. They didn't consider the Byzantines to be Romans. In fact, they actually, because the Byzantines didn't speak Latin, they spoke Greek. And so they referred to the Byzantines just as the Greeks. They said, yeah, their empire is a Greek empire. And it's not really like, and even though technically they're Christians, they don't adhere to what the Pope says, and so they're not technically like a Christian empire, and so they weren't really like, they didn't really consider them Romans, and so they didn't really consider the empire an empire. And so what Charlemagne was trying to do, what they saw Charlemagne was trying to do, was recreate the Roman Empire, and that's why it was such a big deal. People were losing their fucking minds because like, you can't do that. That's not that you're not allowed to do that, but like that's such a futile effort. You cannot reach the splendor of the Roman Empire. Like that's such an insane thing to try. Like, why the fuck would you ever try to do that? That's insane. For our rules. After the Lombard king was overthrown, Desiderius, he and his family were dragged back to Francia in chains. And after being publicly humiliated, they were forced into monasteries. Well, the men were forced into monasteries. The women were forced into convents and to become nuns.
Well, it's same idea. Let me pull up the rules to make sure that that's the only step we take. I feel like that with the overtaking the other one, it's 4 for the 3 shots rule because the church condoned him overthrowing the other empire. So let's take 4 sips.
So yeah, he now is both the king of Francia and the king of Lombardy. In 778, a Muslim noble...
I bet he's getting too big for his britches.
No, because he has some pretty fucking big britches. So like...
Oh, fuck.
So in 778, a Muslim noble from Spain, this guy named Suleiman al-Arabi, who was the governor of Barcelona. Technically, he was a vassal of the Emirate of Cordoba, who was the ruling Muslim force that controlled Iberia at the time. But this guy, Suleiman al-Arabi, who was the governor of Barcelona, came to Charlemagne and said that he wanted to submit himself to Frankish rule. And he requested that Charlemagne send an army in order to secure northeastern Spain. Charlemagne thought this would be, easy land grab. So he sent an army over the Pyrenees Mountains. He ended up being ambushed at the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass and ended up being defeated. This was his only major defeat of his entire career. Even though his army made it out perfectly intact, but he came out of this basically saying like, fuck Spain, and decided not to mess with Spain after that. And so that's the reason why he never made any attempt to like go and kick the Muslims out of Spain. Because the first time that he kind of dipped his toe into it, he ended up getting ambushed and just fucking wrecked. That's a common like question that a lot of people ask about Charlemagne. Is like, why didn't he? Spain was right there. It was ruled by like a non-Christian force. Like, why didn't he ever make an attempt? He did make one attempt, and that didn't end well. So he never really bothered with it again. I figured I'd get that little bit of his history out of the way because that was like the big major defeat of his career.
Gotcha.
So in 782, the Saxons, we're going back to Germany. The Saxons once again rose in revolt under the leadership of this guy named Wittekind. Wittekind led his army into Francia, where he defeated a Frankish army at the Battle of Suntal. And Charlemagne wasn't present for this battle. If he had been, he probably would have won.
Okay, damn.
Yeah. In response to this, Charlemagne held what came to be called. Now, this is one of the. Before I started reading about Charlemagne for this episode, this is what I knew Charlemagne for. This is like the big thing that I knew him for. This was called.
See, I just knew the name. I don't even know why he was, like, important.
This event was called the Blood Court of Verdun.
Oh, Christ.
It was also more commonly known as the Massacre of Verdun. The Franks rounded up 4,500 pagans, 4,500 people. They herded them into a field, and over the course of a few days, a little less like 5 days, they beheaded all of them.
Oh, shit.
Yeah, 4,500 people. This was men, women, and children.
God damn. That's insane.
Yeah, this is just trying to wrap my head, because whenever situations like, because we've talked about a lot of massacres on this show, because we talk about a lot of shitty people, you try to put yourself in that situation, like, because this took a few days to do. Imagine being one of the people who had to witness, one of the people who was killed on the last day. You had to witness this happening over the course of several days, just spending all of your waking hours watching people getting their heads cut off, knowing that eventually your number would come up.
You'd either run or fight or make a last stand.
In this case, like, we don't have a lot of information about what was happening on the ground. We just know that this happened. But I just try to imagine, like, what would be going through your head? Like, what would be going through your mind just watching this happen, knowing that you were eventually going to be one of them? And in my mind, this is Charlemagne's legacy. In my mind, this is the kind of Europe that he made. This is how Europe became Christian. Like, what used to be the Roman Empire was one thing. It was spread through missionaries and...
I mean, we take for granted that Europe was Christian. We don't actually sit down and figure out what led to that.
Yeah, it was a mix of, like, political convenience. Pagan kings would convert to become Christians out of political inconvenience so that they could ally themselves with other, like, more powerful Christian kings. That was one way that Europe became Christian. The other way was the Blood Court of Verdun. And we, like you said, we take for granted that European is just a traditionally Christian land, but we don't really stop to think like how it got to be that way.
To be fair, we don't stop and think about that for 90%. It's just like, oh, it's America, but we don't stop and, like, yes, we know we took land from the natives. We don't think about, like, what that entailed, how horrid, wretched, and evil that was. And everyone's like, well, they should get over it. It was generations ago. The fuck are you talking about?
Yeah, and that's a really good comparison. This was, in effect, Charlemagne was kind of a pioneer of what would eventually become, like, European colonialism. This was a colonial project. This was an act of forcible conversion. And the act of converting the pagans to Christianity was deliberately to make them more amenable to be ruled by a Christian kingdom. So that is a perfectly apt comparison. This was an act of colonialism.
I didn't use that word, but I'm glad you brought it up, because that's kind of what I was getting at. It's the same kind of mindset that led us to Manifest Destiny, that spreading our idea colloquially, like, we should spread to the West, Christianity needs to be spread, or, hey, these people should be introduced, whatever, is very violent when you get down to the bottom of it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of comparisons you could really draw to, like, the Christianization of Germany and Eastern Europe to, like, Manifest Destiny. Because it was an ideological project of bringing the realms of, like, a paganistic or animistic culture into what they perceived as, like, a more civilized ideology, a more civilized way of life as they saw it. And that there's a lot of comparisons that can be made between the Christianization of Europe and the event, like manifest destiny. That is a very apt descript like comparison. That it's just something that struck me while I was reading about this, was like, this is, if you understand the Christianization of Europe as an ideological process, if you understand Christianity as the dominant ideology, the political ideology of Europe at the time, then there's no other way to understand this process but a process of imperial colonialism. Like, that's what it was, and that's what Charlemagne did. If you take that route, you can't help but kind of see what would eventually become like European colonialism across the planet as kind of starting here. So as far as like the massacre of Verdun goes, one of the more interesting theories that I've heard is that Charlemagne used this both as like a form of collective punishment and as kind of a form of like religious propaganda, because the massacre of Verdun very closely mirrors a story from the Old Testament where the Israelite King David, who it kind of suggests that Charlemagne was kind of modeling himself off of King David from the Old Testament, specifically in this case after a story of the Israelites wiping out the tribes of the Amalekites and the Moabites because they had been raiding Israel, the kingdom of Israel. And so there's kind of a suggestion that this was kind of modeled after King David's approach to that situation within the Bible. And so he was kind of consciously modeling himself after a biblical king. I thought that was kind of an interesting sort of theory.
Another one of those, I would have never made the connection, but like it makes total sense. And like, yeah, they're onto something there. I mean, we'll never have a like solid, yeah, that's definitely what he was doing. But like, it's a really good theory. Just like, we're never going to know who the fuck actually was Jack the Killer, because there's always going to be enough doubt that we're never going to be able to say, yes, this was him.
Yeah, it's one of those situations.
Even if we find like really, really good evidence, I don't know that we're going to have enough to say with enough certainty to convince enough people that it was that person.
So the massacre at Verdun would end up sparking off probably the bloodiest period of the war against the Saxons. And the following 2 years after the massacre at Verdun would be it was just a brutal subjugation of Saxony. And he went full hog into the conversion thing. Any Saxon who did not convert to Christianity was either slain or was sold into slavery.
God damn.
By the end of 784, Wittekind agreed to surrender and was baptized.
Wow. Would you count that as rule 2?
What, the church involved?
Yes.
There were a lot of missionaries involved, so I'd say yes.
3 sips, brother.
Yeah, because the primary people who were doing these baptisms, these forced baptisms, were Anglo-Saxon priests that they had kind of imported from England.
That's why I asked, because I wasn't sure exactly how the mechanics works, and I didn't know if it would like fully count for the way you were thinking of the rules, so I wanted to double check.
Yeah, would you count this as him being ruthless?
Did anyone die or get like seriously altered on their socioeconomic status?
Yeah, because this was like the forced conversion of like an entire race, like an entire nation of people. Like the forced religious conversion. And a big part of this process was like a lot of like the traditional nobility, like the tribal chiefs and people like that, who were kind of overthrown and like their lands were like parceled out and given to loyalists to Charlemagne.
That just to me seems like incidental to, for me, ruthlessness is more personal or like more directly impactful. It feels like this is more him just trying to expand his empire.
So yeah, all that business in Saxony, and we'll have a few revolts in Saxony after this, but at this point, this is how Saxony becomes Christian, and in a larger sense, this is how Germany eventually becomes Christian. So after that, in 786, Charlemagne went and started some beef in Italy.
What kind of beef did he start in Italy, Derek?
So at the time, there were a few like scattered, like smaller duchies and and counts and things like just some smaller land-holding nobles in southern Italy who were generally under the fealty of the Byzantine Empire. And he went and he took his armies and he just conquered a little bit of southern Italy. Specifically, the big one that he conquered the Duchy of Benevento. Shortly after that, the duke that he had subjugated, so he went in, he conquered, and he defeated the Duchy of Benevento, and the duke was forced to swear fealty to him. So that duke turned around and went to the Byzantines for help. So let's talk about the Byzantines at this point real quick. I can't remember like all the details off the top of my head, but at this point there had been this whole sort of like civil strife in the Byzantine, in Constantinople, over it was basically a religious debate over the concept of iconoclasm.
What the fuck is iconoclasm?
Iconoclasm is the concept of destroying religious idols. Literally, it translates as destroying idols, destroying icons. And then the context of the Greek Christian church at this time, icons were a big deal. An icon is basically like either like a painting or a mural or a depiction in some sort of either Christ or figures around, or of saints and things like that. So like in a lot of Greek churches, you'll see icons of the Virgin Mary holding the infant Christ. And that was like, it wasn't just like a representation of their faith. It was like an important, like, it was an image that was imbued with the power of Christ. And there was kind of a debate and a lot of shit going on in the Byzantine church at the time regarding whether physical depictions of Christ were blasphemous or not, whether you were actually worshiping Christ himself or just a false image of Christ. And so at this point you'd had a few emperors who had been iconoclasts, who had gone on these giant sprees of tearing the icons of Christ and the Virgin Mary down from the churches and burning them in giant pyres and things like that. It's not super important, but what is important is that out of these conflicts, you get this one woman who I would love to do an episode on eventually, because holy fucking shit is she insane. This woman by the name of Empress Irene.
Okay. What is like the big thing she's known for that relates to our episode?
The big thing she's known for is blinding her own son in order to usurp his throne.
What?
Yeah, she had her own son, who she gave birth to, blinded, had his eyes plucked out of his head so that he could be...
Plucked out of his head?
Yes, so that she could usurp his throne and became the Empress of the Byzantines, of the Empress of the Roman Empire.
Whoa. I'm fucked in the head right now to think about that.
That's pretty fucked up, isn't it?
That is so fucked.
So Empress Irene is who is in power in the Byzantine Empire at this point. So the Duke of Benevento goes to Empress Irene and asks for her help, her military forces, to help him kind of like throw off the Frankish yoke. So the Byzantines, they send in an army and they fight the Franks, but the Franks end up beating them, and more or less kind of just forced out of southern Italy, which is a big deal because the Byzantines had controlled southern Italy for several hundred years at this point. This was like, it was kind of accepted that was Byzantine land, and now they were kind of just being forced out of southern Italy. That's going to come back. Put a pin in that. We'll get back to that in just a little bit. After that, Charlemagne decides he wants to do a little bit more expansion in Germany. So he wants to kind of branch out from Saxony. He went and he invaded the Duchy of Bavaria, which is in southeast Germany. And he overthrew the Duke of Bavaria. And he did this for a couple different reasons. So the first reason was that the Duke of Bavaria was his cousin. And because he was related to Charlemagne, he could feasibly claim the Frankish throne, it wasn't like a huge political threat, but it was a potential political threat that Charlemagne wanted to go ahead and get out of the way, so he never had to worry about it in the future. The second reason was because the Duke's son was the grandson of the overthrown King of Lombardy, who could possibly push a claim on the throne of Lombardy. And so that was another title that he could potentially be threatened with. And so once again, it wasn't a huge threat, but it was a potential threat he wanted to go ahead and just nip in the bud before it became a problem.
He just sounds like, oh, this thing might fuck me over later. Let's go ahead and take care of it kind of person.
Yeah, he was very thorough. If nothing else, Charlemagne was thorough. If the shit in Saxony hadn't already given that away. And so Charlemagne invaded Bavaria in 787, and the Duke of Bavaria immediately folded and surrendered. Like, it did not take a lot to get him to surrender. So the Duke of Bavaria was deposed, and he was forced into a monastery. Yep. So after that, we enter a really interesting... I really like reading about this period of specifically of Charlemagne's rule, because this is a really interesting period. This was after taking over Bavaria. He enters into this long conflict with a group called the Avar. Have you ever heard of the Avars?
No, but it sounds like a sci-fi name.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? The Avars were, the Huns. We had a whole episode on the Huns.
Yes, we had an episode on Attila the Hun.
Yeah, the Avars are in that same sort of mold. They were a nomadic tribal like horse people who had kind of established an empire in Eastern Europe, kind of ranging from like Eastern Austria out into the Ukrainian steppes. And they had and during this period of time, they were kind of the dominant like nomadic horse people in Eastern Europe. Because, back prior to the 1400s, 1500s, Eastern Europe was basically just controlled by nomadic horse people from Central Asia.
Okay.
And they were just the newest tribe of nomadic horse people from Central Asia to kind of control this specific region. And so Charlemagne ended up, he tried to negotiate borders with them very briefly, but that didn't work out. And so he ended up going to war with them for a while. And from our episode on Attila the Hun, you kind of get the idea of like how fucking hard it is to fight nomadic horse people, right?
Oh yeah. Like, it sounds like while they were popular, they were really, like, a bitch and a half to deal with.
Oh, fuck yes, because it is so fucking hard to fight people on horseback, especially an entire army of people on horseback. So, Charlemagne spent a few years defending Bavaria from attacks by the Avars, and then he decided, like, I'm sick of dealing with this shit, and he went on the offensive.
Fuck this shit, I'm out.
Within just, like, 2 or 3 years, the Avar Empire crumbled.
Damn.
I can't emphasize enough how fucking quick it was a turnaround for the Avars. They went from being one of the dominant powers in Eastern Europe to just not existing anymore in like 3 years.
Holy shit. 3 years?
Yeah, just fucking collapsed. And then, of course, once they collapsed, he took all of the surviving nobility of the Avars captive and did what he did best. He forcibly converted them all to Christianity.
Fucking Christ.
Yeah, so all of the survivors of the nomadic tribes of the Avars were forcibly converted and then moved back into Frankish lands and forcibly resettled. And they all became just Frankish citizens.
Wow.
Yeah, it's so fucking... And I'm condensing that down a whole fucking lot. It is a whole complicated conflict with a lot of really interesting intricacies that I don't have time for right now. So, moving on, in 789, Charlemagne's oldest son, who I've mentioned him before, his illegitimate son.
The Hunchback.
He was named after Charlemagne's father, Pepin.
Yes.
Pepin was now an old... he was an adult now. He's in his 20s. He got mad because he wasn't being given... At this point, Charlemagne had started to kind of like... He was getting up there. He was kind of getting close to middle age. And he was kind of thinking like, well, with all these wars I'm fighting, there's a good chance I might die. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set up my inheritance now so that if I die, it won't be a problem. They'll know exactly what to do and we can continue a smooth line of succession and keep this whole party train going. And so he had kind of formulated this inheritance, exactly like what his He had written his will and formulated his inheritance for like what parts of the kingdom each of his sons would be getting. He'd had a few kids by now. None of that land was going to his oldest son
I bet that pissed
because one, neither
his oldest son off.
Oh, yeah. Because one, neither Charlemagne nor Charlemagne's court or the church recognized Pepin as a legitimate heir. And for a second thing, Pepin had a hunchback. And in medieval politics, physical deformities were usually all that they needed to consider you ineligible for inheritance. Because
That sounds about like I would expect.
Yeah, in medieval interpretations of Christian faith, physical deformities were a sign of moral degeneracy. So if you were physically deformed, it means that your soul was deformed as well.
Because that makes all kinds of logical fucking sense.
Pepin got together with a bunch of nobility who were peeved at Charlemagne for one reason or another. You know, politics is a complicated thing, and a lot of people get pissed off when you make certain decisions. He got together with a bunch of people that were pissed off at Charlemagne, and they hatched this plot to assassinate Charlemagne. It didn't get very far. Somebody snitched.
Those fucking snitches. They better got stitches.
And yeah, the plot was discovered. All of the nobility who could be proven to have actually been plotting to kill Charlemagne were immediately executed.
Ruthlessness.
Anybody who was vaguely kind of associated with it that they knew was involved but couldn't actually prove, including Pepin himself, were all forced to relinquish their titles and were banished to monasteries, including Pepin.
So that's I would say like a big gulp and then a shot, because you didn't specify a number, but it was obviously more than one. And then he's being ruthless as fuck by eliminating his allies. Cheers.
Prost. Charlemagne basically had his son forced into a monastery because his son tried to kill him. His oldest son, his illegitimate son.
Did we take a sip for that?
Oh, yeah, we can take a sip too. So, now we go into the 790s. And the 790s were all about religion for Charlemagne. This is when he enters his I'm all about Christ sort of phase. Like, he'd been pretty religious before. This is when he goes hardcore into it. During that time, there were a couple of theological controversies that he kind of wanted to help clear up because, you know, he has ambitions of kind of becoming an emperor at this point. And what's something that the Roman emperors did was they would host councils where a bunch of theologians would get together and they'd kind of discuss like what the orthodoxy of the church. And so that's exactly what he did. So at this time, the first thing that was big on people's minds in the church at this time was that there was this concept that was going around in Christianity at the time. It was this concept called adoptionism, and it was becoming popular specifically among Spanish Christians. So Christians that were in the areas of Spain that were controlled by the emirate, the Muslim. Adoptionism is the concept that Christ wasn't the literal Son of God, but was adopted by God as his son after his birth.
Wasn't a big point of Jesus' birth was that he was a virgin birth?
Yeah, that was a big deal, was that there's a lot of different versions of this concept of adoptionism. I can't remember exactly like what specific details went into this particular strand of adoptionism, but it was becoming a big deal at the time that people were debating. And so Charlemagne organized a council in order to kind of debate the issue. He organized the Council of Frankfurt in 794, which Frankfurt, Germany, in Western Germany. At this council, both the Frankish kingdom and the Frankian church, so both the Church of Francia and the kingdom itself, condemned adoptionism as a heresy, and it was banned within the kingdom. There was also this big theological disagreement going on with the Byzantine church at the time, so the Greek church, having to do with the veneration of icons. So like the Greeks liked to venerate images of Christ and of the saints as like imbued with divine power. The Franks argued that they didn't say that the veneration of icons was necessarily heretical, but they did say that it was foolish at best, and that at its worst it bordered on idolatry, because they kind of argued that it wasn't really like reasonable to believe that you could imbue a physical object, even if it was an image of the Son of God, that image could be imbued with divine power or divinity just because it was the image of Christ, and that at some point you risk kind of worshiping the image itself rather than God. That was kind of their argument.
I mean, they've got a little bit of a point.
Yeah, I can get it. I can understand it. It's the same reason why Muslims don't like depictions of the Prophet Muhammad, because they don't want you to worship him. Because Muhammad didn't want to be worshipped, and Muslims don't believe you should worship Muhammad. He's not to be worshipped. You worship God. You don't worship Muhammad himself. There is also this. Yeah, we talked about that. So all of this isn't really like particularly important, but what was important about specifically the thing with the Byzantines was that it was kind of contributing to what had already been kind of a split between the Western Roman Church and the Eastern Greek Church, which was also itself a sort of extension of a broader political division between Charlemagne's kingdom and the Byzantine Empire. And those theological divisions that emerged from these political divisions would later feed into what would eventually become the schism between the Greek and Roman churches a couple hundred years later, which, if you remember from our episode from the Great Crusade, or from the First Crusade, would eventually, contribute. It would cause a huge political upheaval in Europe, which would eventually result in the First Crusade happening.
Fuck everything over.
Fuck everything over, yes. So in the late 790s, once again, the Saxons started rising in revolt because Saxony is just getting fucked over so bad. They can't tolerate the way that they're living under Charlemagne, which is understandable. Like, how many tens of thousands of people has he already murdered? No fucking shit, they're rising in revolt. Even at this point, most of them are practicing Christians. Like, it's been at least a generation since he started this whole process. Charlemagne, he gathered his army and he led them into Saxony. This conflict would be even bloodier and more devastating than the past two major conflicts in Saxony. Now, he wasn't just conducting executions. He was burning whole towns. He was destroying crops, and he was raping
and pillaging.
He was raping and pillaging, absolutely. And he was also doing...
That's ruthless.
Yeah, that's ruthless. Bros.
Cheers.
So yeah, he's not just killing people now. He's destroying their infrastructure. He's burning their homes. He's destroying their farms. He is destroying everything that it means to be Saxon. And he's also doing mass deportations. So sometimes he'll just go into a village and he'll round everybody up.
So he's pulling a Trump?
No, it's kind of different because when Trump does his yeah, but this is actually relevant. So when Trump inevitably does his mass deportation, when he does, I hate to use this term, but this is the actual term for what happened in the 1950s. When Trump does his own version, his own 2.0 version of Operation Wetback. Have I told you about that?
No.
Operation Wetback, the largest mass deportation in American history, done under President Eisenhower. 5 million Mexican people were deported from the United States. About half of them were American citizens.
Fucking hell, but sounds about right. Or white, however you want to put it.
But when that happens in the United States, those people are deported out of the United States. But back in the period we're talking about, when people start doing deportations, they're not forcibly removing them out of the country's borders. They're actually deporting them deeper into the country's borders so that they can be better controlled.
What?
Yeah, so people were rounded up in Saxony and then forced to move into France to settle there because the cultural osmosis would then cause their kids to become Frankish. It was a form of basically cultural genocide.
What?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense from our perspective because in the modern day when people get deported, they're being forced out.
They're being kicked out, not detained.
Yeah, but back then the point wasn't to get them out of the nation. The point was to forcibly integrate them into the nation. The point wasn't to exile them. It was to...
I get it. I'm just processing it.
Yeah, it's really weird. That doesn't really happen today.
Either we should be using a different term or they should be different term.
I think we should come up with a different term for what they did because deportation implies like exile.
I feel like the way they're using deportation in this instance is more akin to colonialism, imperialism, than it is deportation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 'cause that was the point. Was it was a form of cultural genocide. It was meant to force a group of people to not to it was to forcibly sever them from their native culture in order to integrate them into the imperial culture. Which in North America that kind of happened too. And that's what were like Indian schools or residential schools were.
I would not count what we did to Native Americans as a deportation. It was a genocide.
Yeah, it was a genocide, but like in the instance of like residential schools and things like that, it was a forcible relocation of people in order to separate them from their culture, in order to try and strangle that culture out of them.
I'm not saying your analogy isn't apt. I'm just saying that still calling it a deportation is not apt.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I think we should use a different word for it, but that's kind of this third conflict in Saxony would be even more devastating than the last two. He wasn't just killing people. He was still doing mass executions, but now he was also burning towns, he was destroying crops, he was doing mass deportations. And as part of his efforts to pacify Saxony, he decided to establish the issue with Saxony was such a big deal in his mind that he decided that he needed to move his entire government to Saxony in order to just be nearby in case he needed to deal with them. And so that is how he ended up picking up a strategically placed town on the western part of Saxony called Aachen, the town of Aachen, which is where he built his permanent palace and also a massive cathedral, which is now the cathedral at Aachen is one of the most famous landmarks in all of Germany. Have you ever heard of the cathedral at Aachen?
No.
Look up a picture of it sometime. It is gorgeous. Aachen is spelled AA.
Cathedral of Aachen.
Cathedral at Aachen.
So this must be the cathedral, like the architecture that like Disney modeled after, because this feels like very Disney-esque.
So it had a little bit of inspiration. Disney based a lot of their like construction on the architecture of like 19th century German construction. So like I forgot what it was called. This
Not just this one specifically, but just the general time frame.
a lot of the castles in Disney are based off of castles that were constructed in Germany in like the 1800s. But a lot of the like the grand construction in Germany in the 1800s was inspired by Gothic architecture. And the cathedral in Aachen is the very first example of Gothic architecture. It was what invented Gothic architecture.
So what you're saying is, well, Disney isn't inspired directly by this cathedral. Cathedral is basically was the start of what inspired.
It inspired a lot of the architectural decisions that would create the castles in Germany in the 1800s, especially the I can't remember what it was called. 1800s German castle Neuschwanstein. So in the 1800s, especially in Bavaria, there were a bunch of like major palaces that were constructed that were loosely based on Gothic architecture. The most famous one being Neuschwanstein, which was built in Bavaria. And Neuschwanstein served as the inspiration for the castle in Sleeping Beauty. And then that concept is what would inspire the rest of the architecture, like at Disney World. So yeah, there is a loose connection.
It's more like a row of dominoes kind of thing rather than direct inspiration.
Yeah, it's a lineage rather than like a direct inspiration. But yeah, the cathedral at Aachen is the first example of what we now call Gothic architecture, which I love Gothic architecture. I am a Warhammer 40,000 fan, and all of the architecture in Warhammer 40,000 is inspired by Gothic architecture. It's literally referred, like the term Gothic comes up a lot in Warhammer 40,000. So like,
I'd assume so.
But yeah, that the cathedral at Aachen is on my bucket list. It's one day I I want to take my dad and go on just a grand tour of Germany, and I want to see a bunch of historical sites. I want to see all of the sites in Berlin. I want to go to Munich. I want to see the Völkerschlachtdenkmal in Leipzig, the memorial to or the monument to the Battle of the Nations and the Battle of Leipzig during the Napoleonic Wars. And then one on that list, I want to make it to Aachen, and I want to see the cathedral because I fucking love this cathedral. It is beautiful. It is such a gorgeous building, and I want to see it so bad. It's one of those things. I want to see it eventually, and I need to go to Europe. Man, I want to go to Europe so bad.
I want to visit the world a lot more than currently we are projected to do.
Yeah, I don't know how I'm gonna make it happen, man. I don't know how the fuck I'm gonna do it. I want to see Europe so bad. I want to see Germany so bad. I don't know how to do it.
We make the podcast big as fuck, and we make it part of our Patreon goals.
Record one episode from Munich, one episode from Tokyo.
Fuck yeah. We achieve each other's like destination, like travel goals that we barely aspired to because of the podcast.
Yeah. When we go to Japan together, can we stop by Sapporo, so that we can try Sapporo beer like straight from the tap?
We can be the meme. Oh, that would be beautiful. Yes, if we ever get to go to different countries with the podcast, we can meme out all of our visits with drinks. If we ever get to visit any of our bucket list stuff because of the podcast, I'll consider us successful even if we're not really making money off of it.
So, in 795, the Vatican got a new pope named Pope Leo III. Leo III was lowborn, which means he didn't come from nobility. He was the child of peasants in the city of Rome. So when he was elected, when he was elected to the papacy, a bunch of nobility in Rome, particularly family members of the previous pope, accused him of several crimes and tried to overthrow him in 799. They wanted to capture him, and their ultimate goal was to gouge his eyes out, or specifically gouge his eyes out and cut out his tongue, because that was a pretty common thing, or not common, but it was like a way to cut, like disfiguring people like that was a really common way to disqualify them for political power. Because, like I said, disfigured people were like considered to be like spiritually disfigured as well, so they were kind of considered ineligible for political power. And so that was especially in the Byzantine Empire, if you read a lot up at the Byzantine Empire, a really common way that people would get rid of their political rivals was to cut their eyes out, because when they were blind, it would disqualify them from holding a noble title.
That just feels insane. Cutting someone's eyes out for it.
Yeah, the Middle Ages were so fucking weird. But yeah, that was their goal, was they wanted to cut out his eyes and they wanted to cut out his tongue. And if that happened, he would be disfigured and he would be disqualified from holding office as the Pope. Fortunately, he managed to escape and fled to Francia. So Pope Leo III, he fled to Francia and he requested protection from Charlemagne. And so he made a deal with Charlemagne. If the Franks would help Leo return to Rome and retake the papacy, then Leo would give him a special title that would help him politically. So yeah, Charlemagne sent Pope Leo back to Rome with a bodyguard escort, basically just a small army to escort him. So in November 800, Charlemagne arrived. Okay, so this is kind of convoluted, so bear with me. Charlemagne arrived at the 12th mile marker outside of the city of Rome. Traditionally, this was the spot where, during the age of the Roman Empire, the emperor would meet with delegates from the city of Rome who would escort the emperor into the city in a formal ceremony. It was a ceremonial celebration called Adventus. So when Charlemagne was escorted into the city by papal authority, an Adventus was held as he entered the city. Basically just a giant fucking party all across the city of Rome. So when Charlemagne arrived in the city, he oversaw a council where he heard all of the accusations that were presented against Pope Leo. And then he, in an act of theater, basically, he dramatically declared that he had no authority to sit in judgment over the chief agent of God's oath, or the chief agent of God's church on earth. So he instead had Leo swear an oath before God that he was innocent of any crimes.
Damn.
And so with that, Charlemagne declared that the whole matter of Leo's all of the accusations against Leo to try and depose him as pope, Charlemagne publicly declared with his army kind of outside the city as a threat, basically said, the whole matter of what's going on with the pope is closed. He is the pope. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And he also declared that if anybody wanted to challenge that declaration, that the Pope was under his protection and would have the armies of the Frankish kingdom backing him up.
Damn. He's like, fuck around and find out, fuckers.
This all happened on December 23rd of the year 800. 2 days later, on December 25th, Charlemagne attended Christmas Mass conducted by Pope Leo III at St. Peter's Basilica. At this Mass, the Pope called Charlemagne forward during the sermon. Basically, during the sermon, the Pope called Charlemagne forward to kneel before him. And before the gathered congregation at St. Peter's Basilica, Charlemagne was coronated. He kneeled before the Pope, and Leo placed a laurel on his head and declared him to be Imperator Romanum, which translates from Latin as Emperor of the Romans. Yep. Charlemagne became the first Roman emperor in the West in over 300 years.
God damn. He really wanted to be a Roman emperor, didn't he?
And so began the reign of Emperor Charles I of what we now call the Carolingian Empire, but what at the time was called the Holy Roman Empire. Yeah, so let's clarify something real quick. At the time, it was called the Holy Roman Empire. After Charlemagne died, it was no longer called the Holy Roman Empire because it ended up being broken up between his sons. Later on, the Holy Roman Empire would be revived under another German king by the name of Otto I, who was the king of Germany. So this was technically the founding of the Holy Roman Empire, but the Holy Roman Empire that we would know later on wouldn't be founded until the year 1000. But this was the heritage that the Holy Roman Empire would later be built upon. This is why it's called the Holy Roman Empire, is because they were building on the lineage of Charlemagne, who was declared to be Emperor of the Romans in the year 800. This was obviously, this was really big for Charlemagne, but it also caused a few problems, as beneficial as this was to his political legitimacy. There's one big glaring issue with this whole, becoming Emperor of the Romans thing. The big glaring issue was that there was already a Roman emperor, or rather a Roman. Yeah, rather a Roman empress.
What is that glaring issue?
While the papacy had been nominally under the protection, for a long time, the papacy had been nominally under the protection of the Byzantines, because the Byzantines, the Eastern Roman Empire, was ostensibly like the big Christian force in the former Roman world. But with the introduction of Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans, the Pope moved away from protection from the Greek Church to his own sort of field of political power, which was being protected by the emperor of the now Carolingian Empire, the Franks, Charlemagne. So during that period, the Byzantine emperor, like I mentioned before, there was this Byzantine emperor Constantine VI, who had been overthrown, and he had been blinded by his own mother, who was now Empress Irene. The Vatican claimed that because there was no male emperor, that the imperial seat was vacant, which meant that Pope Leo III, that's how he justified making Charlemagne the Roman emperor, because he said that the throne of the Roman Empire was vacant. This represented a permanent shift in the Vatican's political power from the east to the west. The Pope wanted to leverage Charlemagne's power to increase Rome's influence over the Greek Church, and Charlemagne benefited by having the absolute political and spiritual authority of the Vatican behind his rule, which would allow him to challenge the Byzantine power in the Mediterranean, particularly in southern Italy, which was his focus at the time. The big loser in this whole situation was the Byzantine Empire itself, which would later on contribute to the schism between the Roman Church and the Greek Church. So from this point forward, Charlemagne would spend less time campaigning himself, and instead he started to focus on defending and consolidating his frontiers that he had kind of conquered.
Well, of course.
And so he started spending most of his time in his palace at Aachen, which was, interestingly, on the frontier of his empire. Well, Germany became Christian, so, he did something right.
Probably not the best idea, if I have to guess.
It would be like if during Manifest Destiny we decided to move our capital to St. Louis, from Washington D.C. to St. Louis. That would be a weird choice, but it worked out for Charlemagne. So after Charlemagne was named Emperor of the Romans, he decided to become kind of less involved in expansion and more in consolidation, which is one major difference from Alexander. I make a lot of comparisons between Charlemagne and Alexander. This is one major departure, because Alexander never fucking knew how to consolidate his empire. He was obsessed with the concept of expansion. But Charlemagne, he knew when and how to consolidate. He started to spend a lot of time just in his palace at Aachen, and he started sending out diplomatic sort of feelers with a lot of different powers around the Mediterranean. He made strong efforts to shore up diplomatic issues. The first thing he tried to do was he tried to mend relations with the Byzantine Empire, because, they fucking hated him now because they were trying to claim the mantle of the Roman Empire, which, the Roman Empire still existed. Are you okay? Did I offend you? So Charlemagne, he started making strong efforts to shore up diplomatic issues. And so he started going on this letter writing campaign to rulers across the Mediterranean. He started trying to mend relations with the Byzantines. So this is an interesting little bit. He sent a marriage invitation, basically a proposal to Empress Irene of the Byzantines.
Was he not already married at this point?
I think at this point he was on his third wife, and she had just died. She had died in childbirth.
What happened to the second wife?
Yeah, he had his first wife he divorced. His second two wives he both died in childbirth.
Well, goddamn, I'm probably only gonna have one wife in my life, and this man had fucking 4, or at least had the potential.
Yeah. I think he only had 3. I don't think he got married after this one, because he didn't marry Irene, because he did send a marriage proposal to Irene, and it looked like, because at this time she was on really politically thin ice in Constantinople, and so she was really seriously considering it just to kind of shore up her political legitimacy. which that makes a really interesting historical what if. What if Charlemagne had actually married the Empress Irene?
The world may never know.
That would have because that would have united the Carolingian and Byzantine empires, even just very briefly, which in effect would have recreated the Roman Empire.
So he effectively would have been a legitimate Roman emperor?
Yeah, that would have made him like an absolutely legitimate Roman emperor.
Damn!
But it would not come to be because before she could accept, she was overthrown in a coup.
God damn! I want to see that timeline now. Fuck!
Yeah, that would have been such an interesting timeline. But before she could accept, she was overthrown in a coup, and her replacement was this guy named Nicephorus I. And Nicephorus refused to recognize Charlemagne's title as Roman Emperor.
Damn.
Yeah, the two of them would end up fighting several wars over land in the Adriatic Sea, which is the body of water that's just to the east of Italy. But in 810, Nicephorus was killed in battle against a Frankish army. And his son-in-law came to power, this guy named Michael I. And Michael made peace with the Carolingians, and Michael ended up recognizing his title as Roman Emperor.
Damn.
Yeah, so it's all complicated, but ultimately the Byzantines would recognize his title, but it wouldn't really be, it would be like superficial. There'd be a lot of conflicts between the Franks and the Byzantines later on. And during this time, Charlemagne also reached out to the Caliph of the Abbasid Caliphate.
How old is he at this time?
He's getting into like his 60s and 70s.
So we're nearing the end of his life.
Yeah, absolutely. So during this time, he also reached out to the Caliph of the Abbasidic Caliphate. The Abbasid Caliphate was the dominant Muslim power in the Middle East. They ruled all of Syria and Egypt and Arabia, and were basically like the spirit, both the political and spiritual leaders of the Muslim world at this time. It was ruled by this caliph, who is another really like just utterly fascinating. You know, this guy is fascinating because they made him a leader in civilization.
Oh, hell.
This guy named Harun al-Rashid.
Okay.
And he ruled most of the Middle East and North Africa. Charlemagne and Harun al-Rashid would end up becoming basically pen pals. They never met in real life, but they got to be really good friends, like over letters.
Hey, you're really fucking cool. I'm going to talk to you via long distance.
Yeah, but since they were also like, they were political leaders, they ended up also kind of coming into conflict as well. So they were friends, like they were absolutely friends. Like at one point, Harun al-Rashid sent Charlemagne a gift in the form of, basically Charlemagne sent him a letter saying, I've never seen an elephant before. I'd really like to see an elephant before I die. I think that'd be really cool because I've never seen one, but I've heard a lot about them. And so Harun al-Rashid sent him an elephant.
It'd be like if me and you couldn't admit that we were best bros and we had to pretend like we never hung out, but we still sent each other's gifts.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, al-Rashid sent him an elephant, like an actual Arabian elephant, as a gift. Charlemagne fucking loved this elephant.
Well, a fucking course.
Yeah, he kept it as a pet in his palace. And like he would go out to it daily and he'd like feed it and he'd like play with it like it was a dog. It's so funny reading about it. Charlemagne ended up getting an elephant as a gift from Harun al-Rashid, and Charlemagne fucking loved this elephant. He basically like kept it like a dog. He would like play with it like a dog. And honestly, from the description I saw, he kind of treats it better than a lot of like modern people treat elephants that they keep in captivity. Like he actually he played with it and he fed it and like he let it like roam free and like it seemed to live like a happy, comfortable life, and it died at like a reasonably old age for like an Arabian elephant. So that's kind of cool. He was an animal guy. But yeah, they were sending gifts back and forth. A lot of these gifts, they weren't necessarily out of friendship, but more like a lot of the gifts that Harun al-Rashid sent to Charlemagne weren't really like friendship gifts. They were more like trying to sway him to the Abbasid side, because the Abbasids at the time were in conflict with the Byzantine Empire. And so he was kind of trying to persuade Charlemagne to oppose the Abbasids. So a lot of these gifts weren't like necessarily out of friendship. They were more like an attempt to try to turn Charlemagne against the Byzantines, since the Abbasids were like in an on and off war with the Byzantines. But Charlemagne, he was kind of smart about it. He never really took the bait. He made his political decisions based off of what would be best for Francia rather than what would be best for the Abbasids. Charlemagne did have one more major conflict during his reign in his later years, and that was this weird war that he had with the Danes. The king of the Danes at the time was this guy named Gudfred. So Gudfred, king of the Danes, invaded Saxony in the year 808. A big part of this invasion was, so as a kind of like one of his big strategies was he started sending Viking raids all across the northern coast of France, or along the coast of both northern France and northern Germany, and as well as like the Low Countries, what would eventually become Netherlands and Belgium. The war only lasted a couple years because Gudfred ended up being murdered by two of his generals because, being a small power like tribal pagan Denmark going up against the Carolingian Empire was kind of a lopsided war to begin with.
No fucking shit.
No fucking shit. And so his generals were like, what the fuck are you trying to do? Are you trying to get his attention on us? Fuck no, you're not. And so they ended up murdering him, and then his successor, Hemming, ended up suing for peace. They were able to basically make like a white peace. Denmark was allowed to keep on being their own independent pagan force for a little while. The years 810 and 811 kind of fucked Charlemagne up. During those years, 810 and 811, during those years, all but one of Charlemagne's sons died. He had 8 kids at this point, and I think like 3 of them died.
Which one lived? Please tell me it was the Hunchback. Please tell me it was the Hunchback.
No, he was already out of the picture. He was already in a monastery. He doesn't count. Yeah, he's out of the picture by this point. Forget his oldest son, his illegitimate son. Yeah, he's already out of the picture. Yeah, so I think if I remember correctly, I didn't put it down, but Charlemagne had 9 kids total, and I think 4 of them were sons. Or 5 of them were sons. He had his first illegitimate son, and then he had 4 legitimate sons. 3 of them died in between 810 and 811. And so he had to rapidly change his will. He had to rush to get it fixed.
No shit.
So yeah, Charlemagne, he only had 1 legitimate son left alive. And so he had to rush to write a new will because he was like in his 80s at this. I think he was in his 80s at this point. He was close to fucking death. He was already sick. Like he was on the verge of dying. And so he had to fucking rush to clarify the succession before his son rose to power. Else there'd be a whole shit show when he died. So Charlemagne got sick in late 1813. And he died of lung inflammation on January 28th, 1814. After his death, he was interred in the Aachen Cathedral, where he remains to this day. After his death, he was succeeded by his last surviving son, Louis the First, who is also called Louis the Pious.
Wow.
Yep, he was a very religious guy. He's called Louis the First. The last Louis would be Louis the 18th, who would come to power after the French Revolution.
So a very long lineage.
Yeah, because the Louis the 18th would come to power after the French Revolution and would later be overthrown in another French Revolution in the early 1800s. So this is 1,000 years of France.
God damn. He inspired an amazing lineage.
Louis the Pious's reign was marked by numerous wars, revolts, and general instability. When he died, the empire was divided between his 3 sons, becoming East Francia, West Francia, and Middle Francia. After his death, his two older sons would very quickly overthrow the youngest son, who ruled Middle Francia, and they would swoop in and take over Middle Francia. And I've heard some really interesting theories about like geopolitics that this sort of conflict between East Francia and West Francia would set the stage for 1,000 years of conflict between France and Germany, which would finally end in World War II.
That's insane.
Yeah, because East Francia would eventually, through fits and starts, would eventually become Germany. West Francia, through fits and starts, would eventually become France. And Middle Francia would be just a weird little strip of land between the two of them that they would be constantly fighting over for 1,000 years. So yeah, West Francia would eventually become the Kingdom of France, which would last until the French Revolution overthrew and beheaded Louis XVI. East Francia would evolve into the Kingdom of Germany, which would eventually evolve into the later Holy Roman Empire, which would be dissolved by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1806 and eventually replaced by modern Germany. Middle Francia would be the battlefield over which East and West Francia would fight nearly 1,000 years, only really ending at the end of World War II. This means that Charlemagne was directly responsible for the creation of the nations of France and Germany, and he would be indirectly responsible for the creation of Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Austria, and Italy.
That's insane.
Yeah. It is for this reason that one of Charlemagne's most famous nicknames is the Grandfather of Europe. Another important thing that he did was something that I mentioned at the start of the episode. It was the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne dumped a huge amount of money into the church and used for education and art. The main reason for this was because the priests were the ones who did all the paperwork for his empire. And so he wanted shit to run smoothly, as smoothly as possible, by making sure the priests were as well educated as possible. As an indirect result, his empire had one of the highest literacy rates of any nation on the planet, because these priests would go back to their hometowns to run the churches and teach all of their parishioners how to read. That also meant that the huge number of literate people meant that the empire was flooded with different forms of art and literature. This had a lasting effect on the artistic culture of Western Europe for centuries after. And it would really invent, like, the artistic inspiration created by the Carolingian Renaissance would never really die. It would eventually just kind of evolve into its final form during the Renaissance.
That's crazy.
Probably the biggest thing he did, though, was he cemented feudalism as the primary form of government in Europe. Feudalism was already a sort of informal practice when he came to power, especially in Francia, where it was essentially invented. But one of Charlemagne's big innovations was that he wrote legal codes that formalized feudal contracts and political relationships, which made his realm way more organized than anywhere else in Europe. Using that, he was able to efficiently draw upon feudal obligations of the nobles under him in order to raise enormous armies to go out conquering. Then he was using these feudal obligations. He was able to raise just enormous armies in order to go out conquering. So when I say enormous armies, let's keep in mind.
Enormous for the time?
Yeah, he could raise an army of like 15,000. Whereas most people, like the largest kingdoms at the time could raise an army of like 3,000. Whereas, like, back during the Roman Empire, they had, like, an army of, like, 400,000. And you wouldn't really see, like, Roman Empire-size militaries until, like, Napoleon. So then, whenever he would conquer new lands, he would overthrow the previous tribal nobility, and he would put his own loyal guys in place. So those loyal nobility were essentially what those guys were. They were the first knights. This is when knights became a thing. Charlemagne invented knights. And in a broader sense, like a broader like historiographical sense, Charlemagne was a mirror image of Napoleon. So first, Charlemagne marched out from France in order to sweep away the old tribal systems of Europe to replace them with feudalism. Then, 1,000 years later, Napoleon marched out from France in order to sweep away the old feudal systems of Europe in order to replace it with capitalism. They're mirror images of each other. Charlemagne was a pre-Napoleon. The major downside of this whole thing is that after Charlemagne's death, you're left with generations of basically this class of nobility and knights who would exist and are trained for the sole purpose of waging wars of conquest. So when peacetime comes, or at least not necessarily peacetime, but like times when there's nothing left, nothing really to conquer, these knights' whole purpose, which is the basis of their political power, is conquest, that stops existing. And so you get like a sort of samurai situation where they're not like what we talked about with the 47 Ronin. They don't really have anything left to do because there's no conquest going on. And so left to their own devices, they kind of just become like violent brutes in their own sort of like basically like a destabilizing force in society. And so they end up either just killing each other in duels, starting unnecessary wars, or they just go out into the countryside and they find some peasants to stab, basically. And the unrest among these knights and nobility would eventually become one of the major motivating factors behind the Pope calling the First Crusade a couple hundred years later.
Damn. I know it should be more obvious to us, but it seriously baffles me to think of how many layers and how many, okay, if not for this, this wouldn't have happened. If not for this, that wouldn't happen. Just layer throughout history.
I always try to keep in mind, like, that's absolutely true. But something that I try to keep in mind is that it's not a matter of if this hadn't happened, then that wouldn't have happened. It's a matter of if this hadn't have happened, something else wouldn't have happened. Because something was always going to happen. It's just a matter of it ended up happening the way that it did. But yeah, that's what I have on Charlemagne. What do you think?
You really think we would have more on them in American history, but you know, fuck outside influences in American history, but whatever.
Yeah. Oh yeah, one of the most important that has ever lived in human history.
Nothing America gives a fuck about, at least, to teach our education system to our children.
Yeah. Don't you know history started in 1776? Nothing happened before then. But yeah, the reason I made this the Christmas episode is because Christmas of the year 800 was when he was crowned emperor.
Ah, that makes sense. Once again, we do apologize for getting this out late. It's probably going to come around New Year's this year, unfortunately. Derek, where can they find you on social medias?
Yeah, real quick, the main source that I used is Charlemagne, a biography by Derek Wilson. But you can find me on, I guess you can still technically find me on Twitter at Visigoth.
Said your
go
handles,
ahead.
so go ahead and
Find me on Blue Sky at Visigoth. The first Visigoth, the O is a 0. Yeah, Tim, give them the good stuff.
They can find me at Tim A.K. Otis, both on X and Blue Sky. And they can find the podcast at the Alexander Society Pod on Facebook and Instagram, at Alexander Society Pod, both on Blue Sky and Twitter. And then you can find us on Alexander Society at TikTok. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a rate and review on your streaming platform of choice, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.